Hello, everyone. Welcome to Masterclass, YouTube Masterclass. This is also Coursera class, and that means it's for the university or the college that you're studying at that approves of the class, but we're an adjunct professor. I am an adjunct professor, Dr. Sheley, at USC, Calarts, and Harvard, and we are getting further along in this semester, and it seemed like when we started talking about Orson Welles at the beginning of this, that I had picked some other topic to talk about, and then I had to switch to Orson Welles, which is kind of true, but it's like I'm transitioning from one class to the next. One thing we know is Orson Welles transitioning from one film to the next is a very difficult process too, because they're not really connected films. They connect with an idea of like sort of an existential nature, that everything's meaningless and we wander through life and bad things happen to us, like in the trial that we didn't expect and we didn't have anything to do with it. It wasn't even negative karma that like attracted these negative things to us. And like Orson Welles has kind of this cinema of loneliness streak in his films, where it's like the lead character is alone in their own world, but like the whole world's caving in on him that isn't him. And Orson Welles does these kind of like characters that are megalomaniacs kind of in their own way, like these rich megalomaniacs. He's not commenting on how the rich is bad. He's just commenting on how anyone, even the rich, could be alone. And it's really interesting that they're taken to be these like social pieces, when really it's about like just grotesque like anonymity of capitalism, and nobody knows where the money's coming from. They kind of know where it's going. So it's like Orson Welles is critiquing in this sort of cynical way, like about the world around him, and the world around him, like Citizen Kane, may be greedy, but he may have earned his money, so he's not greedy. But that he is going to probably die alone is interesting, because when he does fall off the stairs, it doesn't seem like he's alone. In fact, it doesn't seem like his girlfriend was there at all, his wife was there at all. But if she wasn't, then why was there stuff left on the stairs? Because wouldn't she have tended to the children before? And so he kicked her out a couple of times, but that kind of gives us the illusion that maybe someone's there, and you kind of hear her yell anyway down the hall when, like, he says Rosebud and falls. And someone had to hear his last words. I mean, if it was just suddenly like that's what he was saying in his last word, Rosebud, but then he tripped and fell and died. Like, it's pretty weird that he knew right away that he was going to die, because that was going to be his famous last word, and he like planned it. And that's kind of self-reflexive of the movie, like how they planned him saying that, and that would be his cue to die, but that he knows somehow that that's his cue to die, even though he doesn't know that he's going to step on a roller skate. And I'm not saying that just because the woman's gone, the roller skate should be gone, but usually in that kind of interest, the woman takes the children with her, and she would, this doesn't make sense though anyway, because she's like calling to him to bring her like some ice water, and it's after he kicked her out in the story. So you see that they're playing around with like narrative, and they're juxtaposing an event that could have happened with an event that could have happened, but like the two kind of have imposing narrative concepts. So like one is on one hand what it is A, and one is what it is on the other hand B, but they're all together complete in this sort of like film that keeps you in the moment, because it's always subjective. It's always following Charles Foster Kane around, and that's the interest of the film. But notice that by the end, there's no more interest in him from the characters in the film, and we're like getting less interested, because the famous last word of the film is the total climactic and resolver at the same time. And it's kind of like a trick to have the shot where the globe smashes and appears in this kind of like, you can see the circular texture, the spherical texture of the globe not as broken. And looking at the camera through that angle must not have been easy. Picking up those shots that defined the montage of the Rosebud fall was a really difficult scene to edit, it looks like, because a lot of it's going in different directions, and a lot of it's push-ins on the, the stand-in item, or the prop, it's like make a close-up on the prop, and then like it's close-up on, it's like a stairs encounter, like, I wouldn't say it's like Potemkinized, but like that he was thinking Potemkin at the time, like if he fell down some stairs, that was totally part of his idea, because that's one of the film club movies that even today with all of our anti-Russia sentiment, somehow the old films of Eisenstein prevail, and that they're not really about leaders that are in charge now, kind of takes the power off of them. And doesn't really make, they are powerful. Movies, though, how they're edited is really smart, and there's a whole sequence where these guys get shot on a staircase, and it's like, that's why Citizen Kane dies on a staircase. I'm not kidding. And there's all these notorious staircase scenes in Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. And there's just staircase after staircase in the same house, and so it's like, I think it's a noteworthy achievement to have a second floor when the film camera is kind of limited to the bottom floor at this time. Not really, though. They could have taken the whole stage and crew up a notch and been above, but things can fall through the floor that way that are heavy, and there's other things to take into consideration when filming on above something, on, like, if you're on the second floor, third floor, all the way to the top. If it was like a skyscraper and they let you film there, then business building and they let you film there, that's one thing. But if you're going to bring a big apparatus there and create a studio, that's why most studios are on the ground floor, because the studio, it's not going to want anything to fall through, and plus that way they can make a ceiling kind of look like where the roof should be. And you get these, like, one thing that's cool about movies is you can take these shots of the establishing shot and later go inside, and it doesn't have to be the same building. I mean, even in The Graduate, which I'm not sure how many versions there are, but when they're at USC and they say they're at Berkeley, there's only like a couple of frames of Berkeley, and the rest is USC, but he says in the movie he's going to Berkeley. This makes me wonder if an establishing shot is where you want it to be, and an inward shot is where you want it to be. And if you recognize any of those as the real place, then you're probably not making the movie, because somehow every movie that's made, especially in a specific place, never gets to go back to that place again. It's like sworn off to all filmmakers again. It was kind of like how they banned everybody from going to Twin Peaks up on the mountains over there. No, anyways, they're actually nearby me, the Twin Peaks mountains. They're right up this hill, and this is a secret just to you film goers to love that, because like, David Lynch was such a strong and powerful director, and in a way, like, David Lynch kind of has the Orson Welles, D.W. Griffith, John Ford spirit, that they're going to carry on the tradition of cinema. For the myth of total cinema, which we've seen is a required review of all the taxonomy of the art of film, like the lighting and the design and the mise en scène and the montage and the things that are stylistic, considering the auteur, and the things that are stylistic but also formal concepts like genre. And that style comes from a mixture of all that, is kind of what we've been looking at with Orson Welles. Being an independent filmmaker, he still had to have the greatness of a non-independent, like a studio filmmaker. And studio filmmakers are like John Ford. They make exactly what the studio wants, that they told them they were going to make. They tell them, the studio, what they're going to make, and the studio tells them that's the exact film that they want. And I kind of go with that. With Orson Welles movies, he kind of builds on these ideas of, like, we're improvising because we're from the Houseman Theater, so we're going to, like, pick a scene to put in here and film it, but it's still not filmed in order it's shown on Citizen Kane. It's all juxtaposed intentionally. And that wasn't just later in the editing room, because the Joseph Mankiewicz script, which is a big script to reel in if you're Orson Welles, and he had to work on it with him. And so there weren't like any discrepancies to the film being out of sequence where it was. That wasn't even the issue. And that's amazing, because like Citizen Kane seems like everybody fought over it so much that it would have gotten warped and twisted and contained and completely thrown out and, banished or whatever. But that Citizen Kane really got a boo from the audience when it was about to win an Academy Award, and that's just because he was kind of new at it and he had only made Hearts of Age before. And so now we're all the way to learning about The Trial, and it's like Touch of Evil and The Trial are pretty close to each other. Touch of Evil's 1958, I think, in 1959, and The Trial is 1966. And there's other movies too, like Chimes at Midnight comes out, around this time, and we'll take it piece by piece that we get it. But before I get into The Trial, I'm just explaining that Orson Welles is going on fire, but he's also collapsing many movies along the way that don't get made that he's asked to make, and he sort of says yes, and every filmmaker does that and kind of loads it up the bag, and then he makes up a film that he isn't even seeing, and that's kind of where The Stranger came from. It was just this like improv that they auditioned one day and kind of did it that way, and it was like, why the Nazi was a total bad guy when he represents loners and winners and people that really fight for what's right. But like, that at that time the Democrats were a little wary of Hitler anyway, because he was starting to blow up part of the world, and so that was mainly why but like, that's all politics from another country, another demonstration. I don't really think that in the end there's many that hold grudges on either side. It's like at the end of the Civil War, they're all working together again. And I think that that's a power of a motion picture director. They can really show you someone's life and show their own life and how that matches it, and say, this is the life I want to bring to the cinema to life. And that's why human characters and human subjects are so wanted in films, especially the great ones. And Orson Welles like establishes this style right when he comes at the Citizen Kane, and now we're at the trial. So now it's going to be highly stylized, highly self-reflexive, because we're in the middle of the 60s. That it's all modern now, and it went modern at Touch of Evil. Touch of Evil's like the beginning of modernism, really. And you have Psycho by Hitchcock for the mainstream studio guy, but Orson Welles is still going as the independent filmmaker of the last 20 years, at this point. With the trial, and the trial may come after Chimes of Midnight was released, and we'll get to Chimes of Midnight. I've got a whole lecture about Chimes of Midnight. It's really interesting about Shakespeare and Falstaff and how they did Macbeth and Othello, and then it all came together with Chimes at Midnight. These are really risky movies too. They're like hard to get your money back for. Like, you'd want to, but if you wanted to, making the movie and making it have enough commercials to be commercially successful as an independent director can be challenging, but that everyone liked the oddity of Orson Welles being an independent filmmaker. They didn't mind ravaging upon him money at the studios, even, which independent guys kind of get the money from the studios anywhere, give it to them. And then they make their movie, and then Orson Welles was buying in on a lot of the companies that he was working with, and that, like, he got to use the Mercury Theater to propel him to start, is interesting, because you skip forward to how the narration hadn't been a big option except in Magnificent Ambersons, and that there's narration in that is kind of forgotten because it comes really quick. There's even female narration in Magnificent Ambersons. And you kind of, when you hear that, it's later in Shadow of a Doubt, you kind of have this young female character who's hearing like the narrator, sort of, but it's not the narrator this time, it's the killer, It's like from his POV, and it's her uncle, and he's a killer, And I'm saying that because these are like mythological plots. Like the Citizen Kane mythology is like the guy gets more and more famous, more and more rich, more and more powerful, and then right when he's on the top, all the women in his life leave, and the rest of his family is all dead, and he's alone. And yet there's someone watching something downstairs, like a play or something, when he trips and says Rosebud and all that. Like, unless there was a hidden camera in there, and that'd be ironic, because like the hidden camera would be at an actor playing a person's house. So that's a good call. We can associate it so much with William Randolph Hearst and the way he ran his newspaper and the way it was working out, but forget about that for a minute and go with the trial. Now there's like some narration on the trial, like there's with Chimes at Midnight on text, and it's like these Alexander Nevsky Star Wars like text, and it writes it out, and Mr. Arkham kind of does that too. But in the trial, you get this whole like Alexiev and Parker, these animators, like they come in and they make this pin board like into animation for the credits to Orson Welles' The Trial. The trial is where Alexiev and Parker, they come in and they build this big pin board and push things through, those pin boards that you can like push your hand through to see your hand on the other side. Well, they built all these like credits out of that, and they used to build really beautiful designer credits. Now, whether or not Orson Welles saw that, he might have had a chance as an independent director. The studio would have whisked it away from him and planned on never letting him see his films. That he didn't need to because he made them is one of those secrets of filmmaking that everybody who's a filmmaker adjusts to. It's like, well, I know my movie's complete because everybody else kept putting it together after I had, so it must be like, it must have needed some work on that, what they saw, and that means that my job is pretty much done as a director. And so it's not an easy process, though. And I think with Orson Welles, it's really difficult because he's breaking new ground on independent film. Like, there's not really been this trust in independent filmmaking except for like Buster Keaton and like Charlie Chaplin. And really, that Oscar Micheaux was a major independent director, totally brought Orson Welles to his height because, once again, he was going to the film clubs and really liked as a kid Oscar Micheaux, but that no one ever saw it. That was of the white race is not totally true because G.W. Griffith must have seen it to see if he got his investment back, and it's a total notorious case. All those movies are a notorious case of independent cinema going right at first, and then it's kind of for one group, so it's not even independent anymore. It's like African American independent, and they kind of take off with their own thing. And that the Houseman Company doesn't really have much to do with that because it's a different set of like those African Americans that go to the Houseman Project because they're not discriminated against there. So Orson Welles is already showing that he doesn't discriminate, making Othello kind of charmed. And I don't understand, like, exactly what Alexiev and Parker are doing at the beginning of the trial. Like, they're pushing the credits in, and it's like Touch of Evil's credits was wild. And so they dial in this text that it's like, anyone who goes through this door is a short story. Anyone who goes through this door will die, so don't go through that door, but it'll remain closed until you open it, and then in the minute you open it and go through it, you die. And this was the story that, like, foreshadows and, like, becomes this sort of envelope, it would say, this big, like, resort to only madness prevails in the trial, because what happens is the lead character, who's played by Anthony Perkins, and this is a short story based on Kafka, but based on other things too, and I don't want to get into Kafka or anything, but there's other things too that have to do with this story, and they usually read Metamorphosis in school, but the trial is another one that other authors have made. The trial, and even the Crucible comes out to be sort of this trial episode. It means they're condemning you from the courts, from the law, from the government, without you having done anything, or even if you had, it wouldn't have mattered, because they're totally going to come after you no matter what. It's one of those Brazil plots where the guy knocks a dead fly into the typewriter and it ends up killing all these dudes named Buttle instead of Tuttle. And it's like, well, that's kind of the thing with the trial. They're just coming to take him, and they don't know what for and what reason, but they know he has to go to court and be arrested. And so it's all this, like, The Wrong Man is kind of one of those shoot-offs from that, because by Hitchcock, because it's like the idea that the guy is still being falsely accused. But we see in that movie that he's falsely accused, and then he goes to jail, and then he has to serve his time, and it feels really crappy, and he gets out, and he's kind of messed up because it was like post-traumatic stress disorder. This guy had never been to jail before in Wrong Man. So it kind of makes us feel for him going like in a Bresson kind of way, like he's just stuck in, it's Henry Fonda, and he's just stuck in jail, for most of it. But the trial's a little different because they just like put him up against the wall, and they haven't told him why, and all they've told him is they don't know why. They don't know why they put him up against the wall, but they do. So now he's being like pushed around, and this is like a different Anthony Perkins than we've seen, because he's being pushed around, jabbed around, stabbed with knives. He has to like walk a certain way in the film, a certain direction, or he'll get like clubbed, Like all these guys, the whole world he woke up that morning and the whole world turned on him. Everybody in his bedroom came in, whether it was his servants or total strangers. Then the FBI is there. He's like being pursued in this sort of like Kafka-esque tale that it comes from a similar man who's a writer who's assailed by the government for being subversive in the trial. It's weird because they tell Anthony Perkins' character that he had done something with subversive literature, but they're never quite sure what it was. And so they didn't have actually the knowledge of the Kafka article entirely changed the way it was earlier in the trial, but every time that someone uses a plot like the trial, it's based on Kafka's The Trial usually. Although again, there were other issues, even American, of a trial gone wrong, or a trial that's gone wrong before it even started. And this one with Orson Welles is pure avant-garde, pure experimental. Like, that's why he has the pinboard at the beginning. The way he edits it, it's like a cubic film, because it's like concentric. It's like the door we don't go in. Every door he goes out, he's getting closer to the entrance of Plato's cave, and he's going to melt by the sun. His wings are going to melt on the sun. I mean, it's the old mythology that you go one way and you're still going the other. And if any movie's going one way and still going the other, it's Trial, because it keeps receding, you think, to his bedroom, or that shot at the beginning. You're still imprinted in your mind what it is, because by the time the whole thing gets like a media circus, and they're flattening out all these ironies metaphorically in the trial. The main one is his cosmic indifference, like that he's being attacked and all these horrible things are happening, and everybody turns a blind eye in the whole city, or they're accusing him of something. Like, they'll accuse him of something wrong. And so Orson Welles was going for the experimental in his films, and he was going, even with Citizen Kane, and that's one reason it's out of sequence. And he was going for this thing in the trial that was kind of out of sequence, but still in sequence, because the sequence only mattered, like in a Brazil way later when that film comes out. And you see that it's a set piece that's involved in this sort of post-apocalyptic conniving that's getting us sent to court, which is like our subversive writing. But that Orson Welles is behind the screenplay of this, because he's behind the screenplay of even Citizen Kane and all his other films so far, and he's always part of the screenplay action. And that's one thing that differentiates him as a director, is that he always oversaw the script, and that he was very literate and knew how to write, was one of his main strong suits of even getting Citizen Kane out. And that he had probably written some other scripts before Citizen Kane, but no one knows if they are, because there's even that like theory that like L. Ron Hubbard wrote a lot of scripts in the 30s, and like no one knows what happened, all of them, but they still exist. Like, some of them you can find them, and it's weird, because when someone's like a champion of writing that gets like decades of interviews and decades of why they have the claim to fame in their interview, and then like suddenly you bring something up like Orson Welles, and I've had like some people tell me, well, that's an insignificant topic, and I'm like, well, it may be, but it's still significant in the film studies. And see, what you got to realize about this class, if you just don't be mistaken, this is a film studies class. Like, this isn't like, it's not like just a regular media class, but it could be used as a media class, communications, But it's really about film, and the idea of opening a film school, I mean, I would have to go over every Orson Welles movie eventually anyway, which we did in some of film criticism. We say, Orson Welles is this independent filmmaker. He's avant-garde. He uses his own money to produce the film. He always reads the screenplay while he writes it. And he always has a writing partner like Joseph Mankiewicz that he travels with the Mercury RKO Theater. Is a total epic legend of like how RKO was still going great with King Kong and produced Citizen Kane, and that the tendencies towards an Orson Welles film being a Mercury Theater production are kind of towards the Citizen Kane Magnificent Ambersons. By the time he's using real movie stars from Hollywood, is more of Touch of Evil. And Touch of Evil we talked about last time, and I really understand that there's a whole notion of like every touch he touches, even Marlene Dietrich's like sleeve, that's the touch of evil. Or when she touches her sleeve, she's going to poison him if he kills anybody. And she has to tell him that in this total showdown where Marlene Dietrich doesn't even get up. She's like, I got him beat now that he thinks I'm cute. He's like, well, yeah. And he comes in and like hugs her. It's this really dramatic scene where it's like Marlene Dietrich and the villain from Touch of Evil. And you're like, it's like he once loved, but now no longer can, And so, really, that there's a cubist, like, jigsaw puzzle to the trial is because all the shapes of it are like from the corner out into like these sort of like long arched, like shots that are zoomed out. It's like telephoto, and then there's zoom, and telephoto is like the zoom, and like that's how you get it, like to push out on the camera and make it like a closer up scene, is by pushing it out. But if you're doing like a Fish Islands, like some of those in Touch of Evil or even Citizen Kane, when it almost looks like a surveillance window, then it's like you're working with cameras that are like in a medium but that haven't been like completely like built yet. And so Orson Welles is like ahead of his time for what he needs, because independent filmmakers can pack light ever since the Dogma thing came along, and you can just use a regular camera for natural light, natural acting, natural sound, and natural picture. And so you get these like all these natural qualities about a film, and it still seems surreal and fantasylandish, even with like some Harmony Korine's movie, Julian Donkey Boy for Dogma. I mean, it gets really surreal. I mean, it may be like a reality that you can film and record and put on tape and put on digital medium, but it's this whole world of the film that becomes surreal. And that's something that like Orson Welles grasped, was the mystique of the film. Like you can tell he really liked it, and that he was at clubs, and that he was kind of like Hitchcock's like other side, you know, like the darker side usually, but not always, of Hitchcock, and that Hitchcock did The Wrong Man and he did The Trial. There's two different concepts, you know, Hitchcock's being that The Wrong Man is accused later of having not of doing it when he didn't do it, so he was the wrong man. But The Trial is like not only is the wrong man, it's the wrong house, the wrong day, the wrong year. They don't even know why they're there. And so you see this absurdism taken out in the theater of fact and theater of cruelty, which Orson Welles is, of course, introducing this concept to the narration as though we're watching last year at Marion Bad, you know. And that movie's not even out yet, or is, because these movies, Chimes at Midnight and The Trial, it's hard to say which one came first. I'm going to guess that Chimes at Midnight came at 65 and Touch of Evil 66. But this is the thing. With the Orson Welles filmography, they're always having trouble with certain revisions, because it seems like the movies that he directed or acted in, those are all set in time, but all the ones he abandoned, like for instance Don Quixote. When he was doing Don Quixote, he was really intensely, and this was around the time of Touch of Evil, he was really intensely going into how he was going to make it, even into the 60s, and how it would be this big epic of Don Quixote. So what happens is later is that script falls to the wayside because people keep trying to do it, and it's like a Waterloo. It's like where they ended up almost losing it as director and didn't get back in. And Orson Welles, you'll see, has many of those, but of where he thought he'd lose his shirt over it. But the Waterloo in the film, usually foreseen, makes it not as worth it. So that it looks like Chimes at Midnight should have came out later, but may have, and that like The Trial is over here. There's still movies in between all these movies every year almost, if not every year, that either go down with the ship, or they're not the ones making it out to theaters, or that they were never intended for theaters, or that they were intended only for an elite audience, is one thing you can do in Hollywood Classical to hide a movie from the public. And really that they would do that kind of a movie as a secret. You know, it's a film school secret, only because people would go ravenous looking for it, and like even film buffs and film school would be like, well, I have to see the missing footage of Greed if it still exists, you know. And then you're like, back to Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons, how it got mangled by some copy editor clerk that didn't know what editing was, and they just started chunking out scenes because there was too much time in one way. They did the same thing to Touch of Evil, so by the time you're at the trial, you don't even know it's been censored out, because it's like going all Brazil, and all the heads of these guys are turning into like bobbleheads, and like everybody's in the courtroom turning Jacob's Ladder in this, and it's like really like Jacob's Ladder, because it gets scary. And it's very Kafka in the scariness and the metamorphosis of like how he's going to turn into a bug. And there's this whole thing where like it's Kubrickian, but it's Wells, and it's like that it's coming out around the time of Doctor Strangelove, and that it kind of has this into the world theater of fact, theater of cruelty thing going just for the male melodrama. And there's sort of this male in crisis notion, but it's not really your normal kind of crisis, because he's all accused, wrongfully accused, of course, but nobody knows what he's accused of or why. And that's what they say in the Alexia from Parker earlier, the thing that comes, the pinboard animation that comes over the credits. And so you're like, he doesn't know why he's being taken, and he doesn't know why. But then these things become like obvious to us as the things you would need to know if you're being dragged off to court. Like, why am I going? What happened? So it's an absurd reason. Nobody knows the reason. Nobody has a reason, and we're taking you anyway. And then it's like, well, what's the reason that you're taking me? And they're like, we don't have we don't have to have a reason, but we don't anyway. So it gets really absurd how you're trying to battle a power of cosmic indifference is like means that there's no God watching us that can get us out of the situation anyway. And like they really would, if there was gods like that, because it's like a failsafe to say that with the trial that the actor's still alive after it's over. But you have to go through some intense psychological patterns to get to the point of someone that's paranoid when they have the right to be paranoid and they can't get out of the loop of being destroyed by this sort of overseen force of threshold that's coming at his character in the movie, Anthony Perkins' character in the movie, who's scared out of his mind that it's going to keep getting worse, because even at the beginning they tell him that it's going to keep getting worse, like these people that are kind of anonymous agents of some kind of FBI place or something, or very Samuel Fuller conspiracy in this one. And that there's a big conspiracy going on in the trial. It's funny because we keep seeing it, what the conspiracy is, and then we're still amazed that they're still coming after him for no reason. And so this is the one film where you're going there's no motivation behind the antagonist, and it makes them almost like a bad, an evil antagonist instead of just a not knowing what to do antagonist. It's they become so evil that they're this kind of in this sterile state of standing still in the shot and always pointing and accusing Anthony Perkins' character as though he's done something wrong. And this seems like the Russian one, where everywhere he goes, there's someone pointing at him. Everywhere he goes, there's someone that can hear him. And I'm not trying to freak you out about Russia, because we know that whole situation is a condemned subject. But that we could say Hitchcock directed the wrong man, knowing that Kafka was Russian too, does excuse us a little bit in our English literature and say, well, some of their books, Crime and Punishment, War and Peace, those are good books, even if the country falls to nothing. And we're not judging that, because I'm not a politician. I don't sit here and judge what the law is based on what's happening in the world. There's someone that told me at Masterclass, leadership of Masterclass of me, that this is the kind of class we need taught, and it was just the subject we're looking for, so you're going to get into it and you can teach the subject in detail as you want. There are some of those that caution at Russian cinema, and I'm saying that I would caution it too, because it comes from a perspective Battleship Potemkin comes from a perspective that we don't understand. It's some other viewpoint, and so that it's a bad viewpoint, I'm going to agree and say yes. That it might not be, I don't know. That there are more things to it than I understand, yes. That somehow the UN isn't too panicked about it, or kind of are in some sectors, is kind of one of those things I'll never understand. And even with my PhDs in philosophy, there's some things about the government I don't understand, it's just those trial kind of things where there's fascism for no reason. In Solo, when there's fascism for no reason, you feel kind of mad. In the trial, you just feel psychologically exhausted. Or I just explained to everybody in the whole cast of this, why you think I'm crazy and paranoid is because someone's out to get me and they're going to kill me anyway, and you guys got to help me. And they're pointing at him like he's crazy and paranoid in it. And it's that's the whole point of the story is can you remain sane when the rest of the world thinks you've gone blinky? And Anthony Perkins never really goes blinky in the film. He's kind of just describing what he's going through, harmless as James Stewart and Harvey, where he's just explaining who he is, to everyone. I'm the guy that everyone disagrees with. You know me. And it kind of makes it this abstract locale in the trial. All of a sudden, everything's sort of elevator lifted to some absurd cubist, jagged shot, expressionism. And then he's copying these styles of artistry, Orson Welles. He's using this for his films as different styles of artistry. And he does this to no point, and he does this to the point that you realize that he's one of these collisions with making a film as best as you can, even if it's not human interest along the way of making it, and human interest when it comes out. It may very well intended to be at some point human interest or not. But that there's humans in it is my logical argument. Say, well, there's a little bit of humanism wherever there's humans, but you usually pick the film over ethics. Like the art supersedes the ethics to Orson Welles in every case, because he's making more of an artistic statement, and those are always seen as unethical, whether they cost too much, whether they go too far in incendiary logic, which just means that they're rebellious to the structures of powers that are out there that we're like assimilating to be a classical film, or we're rebelling against in this sort of renegade way to be known all through history as this independent filmmaker. And that at the time he was kind of alone in independent filmmaking. Not many other directors were joining him. Samuel Fuller, we know, directed also alone, and his viewpoint was very different than Orson Welles. So you didn't have to have one political viewpoint like now to be an independent director, because you're really going for the art of the film, which really supersedes ethics of the film. Books can be that way too, like famous books. Like, you don't have to consider the ethic of the story once you read it, because then you're like, well, that's the story, whether it was right or wrong that it happened, I can choose myself. Like, I don't need the point pointed out and like it being there. But like, I like what it is self-reflexively in that trial thing at the beginning with the question mark, and it's like going around them. It's like he's in this maze of doors and he hasn't gone out the one that's going to kill him quite yet. But that, I'm giving too much away when I say that in the movie Orson Welles, there's the trial, there's one version that Anthony Perkins' character gets killed, and there's one version of it where he comes back and resolves the conflict and gets out of the trial and goes back and everything turns back to normal. Now, that he did those endings and personally different redeems it, because he was showing some people, not based on demographic, the ending where you get killed and see how they'd react. It was kind of an experiment to kind of like a demographic, but not the same, because he'd randomly pick who he showed the movie that he won to. And a lot of times he was aware of certain filmmakers watching his films, so he could like have them alluded to in the theater while it's on, somehow, like by re-scratching the edit track. So with the trial, you see like this film noir style too, and it's like really dark. And the film noir is Orson Welles. By now, he dominates the film noir genre, and like A Gun Crazy is like 1949, but the trial's in the 60s. I mean, Orson Welles carries the torch of even the independent filmmakers of the film noir movement, and the film noir movement was greatly pushed ahead by Fritz Lang and Scarlet Street, The Woman in the Window, and those were two perfect, with Gun Crazy, perfect film noir films. Like, they got the Femme Fatale, they got the gun battles, they got the dark scenery and dark night through it all. They got the runaway car in the night. I mean, there's everything that you need about film noir. It's like, well, what else do you have? You have a conniving antagonist who's sort of in a conspiracy theory against you. That's not just this is like the opposite of a classical movie, which is linear, has like 3-act structure, has everything resolved in each act to the next act. And here we have these sort of like diverse waves through an independent film, that you no longer have to tell the story like the way it's told, like, as we all know, is like very rigidly beginning to end, beginning, middle, and end, and everybody wants those to be in order technically, and only allows it of certain breakthrough independent films when they switch time around. When they switch time around in a classical film, what they do is they have the ending first, and then they go all the way to that same point at the end, like they do with Citizen Kane. But Citizen Kane's different because it's not linear in the section following that traces it back to his death. It's not linear. His childhood doesn't come till like halfway through the movie, and like his adulthood life is being lived out in scenes that are like kind of scary when you first see it, because you're like, man, he just sees control of this whole newspaper, and now you're like, will he be able to tame it and work with this beast of newspaper, even with the Joseph Cotton character snidely waiting to give him a bad review for Citizen Kane. No, I'm kidding. He wasn't going to give Citizen Kane a bad review. He was going to give Citizen Kane a bad review. The person, not the movie. In the movie, not the person. So, we've done talked up a storm, and I see we're heading to the end of class. Well, we've got about 5 minutes, and really there's this whole idea with independent cinema. Not only can you use like film noir to your own power, and film noir kind of comes from this auteur of Fritz Lang, him making it at first with the German expressionist films like Caligari by Robert Vini, and it's like there's these massive scales of like production that Orson Welles has seen those massive stages of production and is going for it because he's not a coward. He's a filmmaker who's got enough money to make a film each time, and like he's lost his shirt on like 16 or 17 projects, and Don Quixote, of course, ends up becoming a Terry Gilliam film later and is way cool anyway, the man who shot Don Quixote. And you're like, well, Orson Welles did this whole Don Quixote episode where he's riding on his horse and looking like Don Quixote would look, and that I can't but help believe that some of the go for broke attitudes, though, that failed with him were not just his best learning projects, but were somehow placed in one of the movies that he was making. But they say the style to those films was actually different and was actually one of the reasons that the film negative was destroyed and was actually like a terrible loss when he had to get fired off of it. But that was like when he'd work at classical acting jobs and they'd be like, well, come do a director job for us, and the whole thing would go flat. And it wasn't because Orson Welles was a bad studio director or anything, because even The Trial is like, I'm sure, like somehow connects to Warner Brothers, somehow, because it's like a Kafka tale, and they're going to tell the side of the story that's American version of The Trial, and everybody loves an American version of a short story that's famous because then they don't use the Russian side, and that's where it can be redeemed, as if you were failing to help any Russian out by watching their movies or reading their literature. I don't blame you. And when this whole thing ends, then maybe we can get back to it. But I understand why there'd be a little controversy with me saying the word Kafka. But don't worry, because it's from Prague. The Kafka stories are from Prague anyway. And B, you don't have to worry about it because that's where the Czech Republic used to be, so it's not actually Russia. And C, Third Man is another one of those like The Trial type things, only this time Orson Welles is in the antagonist seat, whereas like in The Trial, Anthony Perkins is in the trial seat, and he's the perfect dude for not knowing what he's done. I mean, at the end of Psycho, he doesn't know what he's done. And like, there's that famous, like, my last words, that I didn't do it or whatever. It's like, but in The Trial, Anthony Perkins is looking like he's saying he didn't do it, and this time he may not have. Like, he may not have done it. He may not have been the one that purveyed the murder of whatever it was that they were accusing him of. And that they were accusing him for the sake of accusing him does kind of go to that KGB attitude, like they're just going to accuse you no matter what. Like, you could do nothing wrong and eat a potato all day, and then they come break in on you. But I'm not saying they're all listening to us, and neither is Orson Welles. But to create paranoia for the film, he had to use some scenes that were Caligari-esque, and he's using this expressionism as like this bleak way of saying this is what a racked psychology from our normal society, racking us to see what we did wrong, even if we didn't, is driving us to this point of like, it's not quite insanity, but it's like the shape of how society is already the insanity, and whether we fall back into it insane is kind of a cynical message, because nothing was really resolved with either endings, whether he got out of the trial and was like, I'm okay now, or whether he had to face the trial and ended up killed by going through the door at the end. And it does suggest, even in the good ending, that he's going to go through that door again, because it goes back to that pinboard structure at the end. And it shows a few more doors open. The door opens, he goes in, he's a dead man. And then it's over. Dead man, and he's over. And that's a lot to process when you're thinking the cynic message of it is like cosmic difference, that even though there isn't anything up in the sky watching us and doing justice, that's the reason no justice can happen in even a crowded area, is because everyone's kind of indifferent to a crime that doesn't involve them in real life usually, or they get called for like voyeurism or something, or trying to like be part of the crime scene and go into it when they're not. And so that can be against the law. So that kind of brings us to where we have the trial, where it's like, well, now there's not even a law that has to be passed. He's just going through it anyway. And this can be a very eliminating to the common sense when everybody else has lost their common sense. When everybody else loses their common sense and it's like the law that does it, then it's really his job to argue with the law. But like whether he wins the trial or gets away from it or not, it's a really bleak movie because it happens anyway. Like whether he's got to like gets cured or not, it happens anyway. And this is a film noir like contribution of climactic strength, because it's like saying that at the end of this he may or may not escape, and he's just showing different people the endings that he thinks are the endings they need. And that's kind of a trick that Orson Welles uses that no other director uses. Like there were even different versions going out about War of the Worlds that weren't live, that he had recorded earlier and had put some of those through the press, and they were different recordings on each of them. And then he did the live one with Mercury Theater and RKO and all that, and like they're already making money off of that in RKO, and RKO's doing pretty good with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, who had kind of these narratives where they're dancing, a little bit of plot about how they kind of like each other, but they're just friends, and then dancing, and they dance the best out of anyone, and you could watch those Astaire and Ginger Rogers dance forever, and you totally applaud that that's RKO. And then you see King Kong at RKO, and King Kong being this big beast, this megalomaniac himself, this owner of everything he blows up, and this sort of like romantic failure of him to be this sort of, ego tripping, but that he's a beast and that he can be killed, is so surprising to him that this woman doesn't really express love toward him. She doesn't know what to think, and how he even loves her seems like a weird instinct that even King Kong would have had, just because he's kind of a beast. So of course he likes women. You get the whole thing that he's like, we would have made a good couple, but I'm about to die. And it's like, that's the same thing with Citizen Kane and how he gets totaled at the end. At the end he falls down the stairs. He must die right then, but he sets up this whole like argument that we needed to read the story on him to see if we'll ever find out what Rosebud is. And at the end of the movie you kind of find it out, and I'm not going to talk about that right now, but it's like that the movie's such a shock twister ending is like totally the King Kong ending, because he's in love and fixated with a woman like Oedipal style, but he won't give up the kingdom of his desire for eternal romance. He's got to give up his rich lifestyle, and that's only because they're using it to abuse themselves with the riches, and now they're going over the top, and it's this total wipeout at the end of Citizen Kane. I mean, the whole thing's a wipeout, and like that he doesn't lose his money is true, but he's dead, so what's he going to do with it? And like the house is like a tourist museum. William Randolph Hearst's house was like a tourist museum, and there's other things that came of the Hearst family that were important in history too, that he owned all the newspapers originally, is the most important thing to remember that's in correlation with Citizen Kane, because some of the facts are not in correlation with William Randolph Hearst. That the trial is not totally based on Russian literature is true, because it's an American redo of the trial anyway, and that story had to be translated into English, which changes the words and the meaning of it when it changes over, just like captures as true as it can to the original statement, or as data as the original statement is. And that's what you need to get out on there. And that's why Don Quixote can be like a challenging script to try and write, even if you wanted to do one now and say you were going to do the Spanish version of Terry Gilliam comes along and puts it all to rest. So that's cool of him doing that for Orson Welles, because Orson Welles kind of had that as like an open problem on his career for so long, and a lot of these movies that are made in between his films are becoming like movies that they're still making now, that they want to pull out of the doldrums just for Orson Welles to finish kind of what he's doing. And then like that one's hard to research, because every filmography is different, and most of them that don't talk about the ones we've talked about as directing in depth are talking about his acting job and like then you get A Man for All Seasons, and you get like Moby Dick, and there's these Orson Welles cameos, and that just means he's in part of it. Like Catch-22, he's in part of it, and he's a cool part, and it's totally Orson Welles of him to be either for his persona or against it when against it is so for it, in his view. And that he does everything differently and backwards isn't necessarily the problem. It's that he doesn't do things the way the studio does, so he's not really trying to go for the market value riches. But then his movies end up being so hard to make, like The Trial and Chimes at Midnight, that they end up being worth almost more than any other movie. Like Chimes at Midnight is almost worth more than any other movie as a movie because it's Orson Welles doing Falstaff. We'll talk about it next time and wrap up on The Trial. So we ran out of time, but we had a lot to talk about. There's still much to go. This was class 7 or 8, and I think it was 7, but we're almost headed for the midterms next week, and there's no midterm, so don't get scared. But we're going to talk in depth about Chimes at Midnight and kind of go over the other films of Orson Welles in this film studies class, where we're discussing not only his auteur style, but mainly what the films are like, because they're different kinds of films, and we're seeing what makes them work and how they're made and everything else that goes along with that. So thank you for tuning in today.